The wind came down from the northern ridges the way it always did in late autumn, dragging the smell of wet pine and old blood through the trees. Trevor Belmont rode beneath that wind with his coat half buttoned and his whip coiled tight against his hip, the iron weight of it familiar as a heartbeat. He had been tracking the creature for 9 nights now. 9 nights of cold rations, broken sleep, and the slow narrowing patience that every Belmont learned before they could properly hold a sword. The villagers 3 valleys back had spoken of a thing that walked between the trees on 2 legs, drank like a wolf, and left no shadow when the moon was full. Trevor had heard 100 stories like it in his life. Most were lies. A few were worse than lies. This one, he suspected, was something he had not yet given a name to. The trail led him deeper than he wanted to go. Past the broken chapel with its weather-smoothed saints. Past the old toll road where the moss had eaten the milestones down to soft green nubs. By the second dawn, the footprints in the riverbank mud had begun to behave strangely. They walked, then stopped, then started again 3 paces away as if the creature had stepped out of the world, for a moment, and returned somewhere slightly to the left of where it had been standing. Trevor crouched beside one of the prints and ran a gloved finger along its rim. Vampires did not move like this. Werewolves did not move like this. Whatever he was hunting was something older or something newer, and in his experience both were equally bad news. He found the bodies near a hollow oak. 3 travelers, a merchant by the cut of his coat, 2 young apprentices by the simple tools spilled in the leaves around them. The bite marks were the part that bothered him. Twin punctures, yes, but the spacing was wrong. Too wide for a noble vampire, too narrow for a beast. And around those punctures, faint marks that looked almost like claws, as though something had held the throat steady before the teeth came down. 2 predators using 1 mouth. Trevor exhaled slowly through his nose and stood. He had been a hunter long enough to know when a forest was no longer a forest. This place had become a hallway, and at the end of it something was waiting for him to arrive. The ruin came into view at sundown. It rose out of the heather like a half-buried jaw, stone teeth cracked and blackened where some old fire had passed through it centuries ago. Trevor recognized the architecture, or thought he did. The arch above the entrance bore a sigil he had seen once before in his father's books, a circle bisected by a long, thin slash, the mark of a bloodline so ancient that even the church had stopped writing its name down. He stepped under the arch with his whip already loose in his hand, and the air inside the ruin felt heavier, the way water feels heavier the deeper you swim. The creature found him before he found it. It came down from the rafters in a single silent drop, all teeth and long pale limbs, and Trevor was already moving before his mind had finished naming the threat. The whip snapped out, silver tip biting along the thing's collarbone, and it shrieked in a register that did not belong to any throat he understood. He drove it backward across the cracked tiles toward the altar at the rear of the chamber, and that was when his heel caught the edge of something half buried in the dust. A medallion. Black metal warm to the touch, marked with that same long thin slash. The light came up out of the floor like a lung drawing breath. He did not have time to brace. He did not have time to curse. The chamber unmade itself around him in a rush of red-gold light, the creature's scream stretching long and thin until it was nothing at all. And the last thing Trevor felt was the cold bite of stone beneath his shoulder as the world he had always known let him go. When he opened his eyes again, there was no forest. There were no stars he recognized. There was only the low sodium hum of streetlights, the wet shine of a road that had been paved by hands far stranger than his own, and the distant hiss of something mechanical breathing in the dark. Trevor pushed himself up onto one elbow. His whip was still in his hand. The medallion was gone. Silence where birdsong should have been. He stood slowly, every old instinct waking at once, and the city looked down at him with 1,000 blank windows and did not blink. He had hunted in many places in his life. He had never hunted in a place like this. And then from the alley to his left came the sound he did know. The soft, deliberate footfall of something walking toward him on 2 feet, pretending to be a man. Then another. Then 4 more behind it. Trevor turned to face them, and his thumb settled against the worn leather grip of his whip, the way it had 1,000 times before. Whatever this place was, the work was the same. The work was always the same. The first vampire stepped into the light and smiled. There were 6 of them in the alley, and they moved like nothing Trevor had ever fought. The vampires he knew came at a man with theatrics. They postured. They monologued. They wore their hunger on the outside like a crown. These ones came at him in silence, fanning out along the wet asphalt with the trained spacing of soldiers, and one of them was reaching beneath his long black coat for something that was not a sword. Trevor saw the pistol come up, and he was already moving sideways, the whip cracking out across the alley in a long silver arc. The first round sparked off the brick beside his head. The second never fired because the silver tip of the whip had already opened the gunman's wrist down to the bone. The vampire did not scream. He simply transferred the pistol to his other hand with the casual efficiency of a man who had done this 1,000 times. And that, more than anything else, told Trevor what kind of city he had walked into. He killed 3 of them in the first 10 seconds. The whip did its old patient work, and the small silver dagger from his boot did the rest. The 4th one came in close, faster than Trevor expected, faster than any noble he had ever crossed swords with, and for half a heartbeat he felt the cold edge of his own age along his spine. Then his elbow found the creature's throat, and his blade found the creature's heart, and the alley was quiet again except for the soft electric buzz of a streetlight he did not understand. He stood among the bodies and looked at his own gloved hands. The blood on them was the wrong color in this strange flat light. He knelt by the nearest corpse and turned it over with his boot. Beneath the long coat, the vampire wore tactical webbing, a holstered second pistol, a small black device with a glowing rune that Trevor would not learn the word for until later. This was not a noble. This was not a feral. This was a soldier. And soldiers, in his experience, always belonged to someone. In the days that followed, he became a shadow. He learned the city the way he had learned every forest before it. He found the places where the hunters and the hunted overlapped, the back stairwells, the abandoned subway tunnels, the warehouses on the river where the lights stayed on too late. He stole clothes that helped him blend, and a long dark coat that hid the whip well enough to walk a street unnoticed. He listened in cafes and in alleys and on the steps of churches that were no longer churches, and slowly the shape of the war revealed itself to him. 2 factions. Vampires on one side, organized in covens and houses, dressed in expensive cloth and armed like a small private army. Lycans on the other, packs of werewolves who walked as men in the daylight and ran the lower city like a pulse beneath the skin. They had been fighting each other for centuries. They had stopped using castles long ago. Now they used safe houses, ledgers, encrypted radios, and bullets cast from silver and from darker things. The world had moved on without telling the monsters, and the monsters had simply moved with it. Trevor watched and Trevor learned. He noted that the vampires were faster than the Lycans but burned more easily. He noted that the Lycans regenerated from anything except a clean silver wound through the heart or the brainstem. He noted the patrol patterns, the shift changes, the small superstitions even immortals could not shake. He filled the inside of his coat with chalk notes and tally marks the way his grandfather had filled the margins of the family grimoire. Then he began to work. A vampire courier vanished on a rooftop in the financial district. A Lycan enforcer was found in a parking garage with a silver wire wrapped neatly around his throat. A coven safe house burned for 6 hours and no one inside walked out. There were no witnesses, no claims, no banners raised. Just a slow, steady subtraction from both sides of a war that had grown used to never losing anything it could not replace. Within a month, both factions began to whisper. There was something in the city, something that did not belong to either of them, something that hunted the hunters. Trevor listened to those whispers from a rented room above a closed bookshop, cleaning silver by the light of a single lamp. And for the first time since he had stepped through the medallion's red-gold light, he allowed himself the smallest, tightest smile. The work was the same, only the prey had grown more interesting. Celine had been a death dealer for 6 centuries, and in all that time she had learned to recognize the rhythm of a kill. Lycans were brutal and loud. Rogue vampires were impulsive and vain. Human assassins were clumsy in ways the body always remembered. What she was tracking now was none of those things. It was patient. It used terrain. It chose targets that mattered and left the rest untouched. It hunted her people the way she had once hunted the wolves, and that was the part that made her finally pick up her own coat and walk into the rain herself. She found him on a rooftop over the old textile district, crouched at the edge of a water tank with a small spyglass pressed to his eye. He was watching a coven safe house 3 buildings over. He had not heard her come up behind him. That alone should have told her he was not what she had expected. Vampires always heard her. Lycans always smelled her. This man simply turned at the very last second, as if some old instinct in his shoulders had finally remembered to wake up, and the whip was already in his hand. She drew both pistols and fired. He was gone before the first round left the barrel, rolling sideways off the lip of the roof and onto the lower ledge with a fluidity that did not match his weather-beaten coat. The whip lashed up and struck the gun from her right hand. She dropped the empty magazine from the left and reloaded in the same motion. He came up over the ledge again, and she met him with the flat of her boot, and for a long, unbroken minute they simply tried to kill each other across a rain-slick rooftop, while the city below pretended not to notice. He was not faster than her. He was older than her in a way that had nothing to do with years. Every move she made, he had seen something like it before, in some other century, against some other thing wearing fangs. The whip was always a half-breath ahead of where she expected it. The small blade in his offhand kept finding the exact spaces between her plates of leather. She landed 2 clean shots into his chest, and he simply staggered, swore in a language she had not heard spoken aloud since the 1700s, and kept coming. It was she who stopped first. She lowered her pistol a fraction, not in surrender but in calculation, and said, "You are killing my people." He did not lower the whip. "Your people are killing each other. I'm just thinning the line. You hunt I hunt monsters." He paused, and something almost like tiredness passed across his face. "If you don't want to be one, stop standing in front of me." She studied him then. The coat, the crest barely visible under the torn collar. The crucifix worked into the pommel of his short sword, the kind of cross her covens had long since stopped fearing because no one alive still believed in it the way the man in front of her clearly did. He was not from any house she knew. He was not from any city she knew. He was, she realized with a slow and unfamiliar tightening in her chest, not from anywhere she knew at all. She holstered her weapons. He did not coil his whip, but he let the tension go out of his shoulder. They spoke for an hour on that roof while the rain thinned to mist. She told him about the war, the elders, the treaty that had collapsed 3 nights running, the strange new orders coming down from the council that did not match any pattern her 600 years had taught her to read. He told her about his world in clipped, honest sentences, about the medallion, about the bite marks that did not match any beast he knew. He told her that the vampires running this city were lying to their own soldiers. He told her how he could prove it. When the mist finally lifted, they stood and looked at each other across the wet gravel like 2 professionals who had just agreed, against every instinct, to share a contract. "Temporary," she said. "Temporary," he answered. Neither of them believed it would stay that way. The first thing Trevor noticed about Celine's safe house was that it had no windows. The second thing he noticed was that every wall was lined with files. Not the leather-bound ledgers he was used to, but thin paper folders stacked in metal drawers, and beyond them rows of dark glass screens that hummed quietly in the dim light. She moved through this room the way his grandmother had once moved through her herb garden, touching nothing without purpose, and Trevor allowed himself a moment to simply watch her work. She had spent 600 years building a library out of her enemies, and now she was about to open every drawer of it for a stranger. They started with the patrol logs. Celine laid them out across the long steel table and walked him through the last 6 months, marking the dates that did not fit, the missions that had been ordered and then quietly forgotten, the soldiers who had been sent to addresses where no Lycan had ever lived. Trevor read with the slow, careful eye of a man who had grown up tracing maps of catacombs by candlelight. He did not read the words. He read the spaces between the words. And the spaces, he soon realized, all pointed in the same direction. "These 3 covens," he said, tapping the table. "They report to the same elder. And every order he signs sends his soldiers somewhere they shouldn't be." Celine leaned over his shoulder. "Victor's old line. I served under him for 2 centuries. Did he ever lie to you?" She did not answer for a long moment. Then she said, "He lied to me about something so large that the truth of it has not finished arriving even now." That was enough for Trevor. They moved deeper. Over the next 3 nights, they assembled a picture out of stolen reports, intercepted radio traffic, and the dying confessions of 2 Coven enforcers Trevor took alive on a parking garage roof. The picture was uglier than either of them had expected. The elders were not simply running the war. They were feeding it. Lycan packs that grew too quiet were quietly armed. Vampire houses that grew too restless were given a fresh atrocity to mourn. Treaties were signed in public and broken in private by the same hands. Whole generations of soldiers had been raised to hate an enemy whose existence the elders themselves were carefully maintaining. Trevor sat with this knowledge for a long time at Celine's steel table, and he did not say anything for almost an hour. She let him have the silence. She had been an immortal long enough to know when a man was rearranging the foundation of his life. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "I've seen this before." She raised an eyebrow. "Different word, different mask, always the same thing." He turned one of the photographs toward her. A vampire elder smiling at a banquet. "They build a monster outside the wall so the people inside the wall never look up at the throne. My family fought monsters for 3 centuries. Half the time the real monsters were the ones who paid us. And the other half?" He almost smiled. "The other half were the ones we hunted. The trouble is they stopped being easy to tell apart." Celine poured them each a glass of something dark and old. She did not say it was wine. He did not ask. "You came here to kill vampires," she said. "I came here to kill what was hurting people. That hasn't changed. The shape's just bigger than I thought." He took a long, slow drink. "I'm not hunting the soldiers anymore. The soldiers are just the teeth. I want the throat." The elders sleep in vaults 100 meters under the city. They are guarded by the most disciplined killers I have ever served beside. Even I cannot reach them alone. "Good thing you're not alone." She looked at him across the steel table. This man who had walked out of a forest 600 years before her time and into a war he should not have understood within a month. And she felt something old and carefully buried shift very slightly under her ribs. "You understand," she said quietly, "that if we do this, neither side will ever forgive either of us." "I've never asked a monster for forgiveness in my life," Trevor said. "I'm not about to start with the ones who think they're gods." The plan they wrote that night was simple in the way only dangerous plans ever are. Trevor would burn the war from the bottom. Celine would burn it from the top. They would meet in the middle, where the elders had grown comfortable in the soft dark, and they would find out together what an immortal looked like when it finally remembered how to be afraid. The candle on the steel table guttered low. Outside, the city slept on its lie. The first night of Trevor's war began with a fire on the docks. He had spent 2 weeks turning Celine's intelligence into something his hands could use, and the result was a long line of small black satchels arranged neatly along the rafters of a Coven warehouse that had not been on anyone's official maps for 40 years. He set them with the unhurried precision of a man tying flies for a long fishing trip, and when the last fuse caught, he was already 3 rooftops away, watching the orange bloom unfold through the smoked lens of a stolen pair of binoculars. 47 enforcers were billeted in that warehouse. None of them came out. The few who tried met the silver wire he had strung across the only door wide enough to fit a shoulder. He was old-fashioned that way. He believed in sealing the lid. The Covens responded the way he had counted on. They tightened. They concentrated. They pulled their best units back into the inner districts to defend the elders, and in doing so they thinned the patrols on the outer ring exactly where Celine needed them thin. She struck the second night. She walked into a council security barracks she had once commanded herself and emerged 40 minutes later with a leather satchel of recordings. 3 dead lieutenants and a single name written on her palm in blood that was not hers. The name belonged to the elder who had ordered the murder of a Lycan child the previous winter to justify a purge. Trevor took that name and wrote it on the inside of his coat next to all the others. By the 4th night, the city was no longer pretending. Vampire patrols moved in hard squares now, 3 vehicles minimum, every window armored. Lycan packs, sensing weakness, came out of the lower tunnels in numbers that had not been seen in living memory. The carefully maintained balance the elders had spent centuries cultivating began to wobble for the first time, and the wobble turned into a tilt, and the tilt began very slowly to look like a fall. Trevor fought the way his family had always fought. He never met an enemy on ground he had not already mapped. He never entered a room he had not already poisoned. When a Coven assassin tried to ambush him in a stairwell, he was waiting at the top of it with a grenade he had built from a Lycan's silver bullets and a hand mirror angled to reflect the light of a dying lamp. When a vampire enforcer cornered him in a parking garage, Trevor let him close to within 2 paces before the silver chain hidden in the support beam came down and removed everything above the enforcer's collarbones. He did not enjoy any of it. He simply did the work, the way a man cuts firewood for a long winter, with the steady knowledge that the cold is real and the cold does not care. Celine fought differently in the same. She turned old loyalties inside out. She walked into the chamber of a senior elder named Aurel during a council session and laid the recordings on the polished obsidian table without saying a word. 3 of the elders rose to defend Aurel. 2 did not. Within an hour, the council was at war with itself, and within 3 nights the lower covens had begun to choose sides, not by tradition but by whatever fragment of truth they had been allowed to glimpse. Some defected to her openly. Others quietly stopped showing up for orders. The vampire hierarchy, which had stood with the patience of stone for 1,000 years, began to crack along seams nobody had remembered placing there. The Lycans, who had been loud and clumsy for a century, suddenly grew clever. Their alpha, a heavy-shouldered man named Raz, sent a runner to Celine with a message written in human ink, and Celine read it twice before she handed it across the steel table to Trevor. The Lycans had figured out who was running the war. The Lycans wanted to talk. Trevor read the message and laughed once, shortly, the first real laugh Celine had heard from him. "They've been hunted by liars for so long they forgot honest people existed," he said. "Tell them yes. Tell them the ground rules. Tell them no claws above the table." The meeting happened in the basement of a derelict opera house, and it did not turn into a bloodbath, which was, in that city, in that century, a small kind of miracle. Reyes and Celine exchanged what their grandfathers would have called terms. Trevor stood near the door with his whip coiled and his eyes on every exit, the way a man stands when he is the only sober person in a room of recovering drunks. By the 7th night, the elders no longer ruled the war. The war ruled them. Their armies fought without orders. Their vaults were no longer secret. Their soldiers, for the first time in any of their long, dim lifetimes, began to ask questions of their officers that no officer had been trained to answer. And through all of it, in alleys and on rooftops, and in the soft mortar between centuries-old stones, one man with a whip moved like the slow, steady hand of a clockmaker correcting a clock that had been running fast for far too long. The vault of Aurel was the last thing to fall. It lay beneath an old bank in the financial district, 400 steps down a stairway that had been built when the city above it was still a fishing village. Trevor and Celine went down those steps together. They came back up alone, which is to say, only the 2 of them came back up. What they left behind in the vault was finished business. Above ground, the city had already begun to change. By dawn, 3 of the 7 elders were dead. 2 had vanished into networks even Celine could not penetrate. The remaining 2 sent emissaries to her safe house before noon, asking, with the careful diction of people who have just understood that they are mortal again, what terms she would accept. She accepted none. She did not sign anything. She simply gave them a single sheet of paper with the truth of the conspiracy printed in plain neutral type, and told them to read it aloud to every coven that would listen. Some did. Some refused. The covens that refused fractured within weeks, because the soldiers themselves had begun to read the document by candlelight in their barracks, and soldiers who have read the truth do not easily go back to taking orders from men who lied to their fathers. The Lycans, for their part, did not seek revenge. Ray surprised everyone, including himself. He sent his packs back into the tunnels and the warehouses and the long-forgotten burrows the elders had quietly denied them for 3 centuries. And he told them to rebuild, not to retake, to rebuild. His packs grumbled. They obeyed. A wolf, Celine observed quietly to Trevor one evening, can be wiser than a vampire when it has to be, because a wolf has never had the luxury of pretending it was a god. Trevor stayed in the city for 11 more days. He watched. He waited. He made sure no elder had survived the night who might come crawling back into the dark to start the wheel turning again. He did not enjoy the watching. He was a hunter, not a magistrate, and the slow administrative work of a city learning to breathe again was not the work his hands had been shaped for. On the 12th morning he came to Celine's safe house with his coat patched and his whip cleaned, and she knew at once what he had come to say. "You're leaving." "I never wanted to lead anything." He set a small package on the steel table between them. Silver shot. The last he had cast in the city. "I'm not the man this place needs now. The man this place needs now writes laws. I never learned to write laws. I only ever learned to read men." She nodded slowly. "Where will you go?" "Wherever the next one is." He paused, and for a moment something almost gentle moved across his weathered face. "There's always a next one. That's the trouble with monsters. They're patient. So are the men who use them." She walked him to the door. The morning outside was the gray of cold iron, and a soft rain was beginning over the rooftops of a city that had, for the first time in centuries, no single hidden hand inside its walls. At the threshold he turned back to her. He did not embrace her. They were not those people. He simply looked at her for a long, quiet moment and said the only words he had carried with him from his world that he believed every world deserved to hear. "Monsters aren't the problem. The ones in charge usually are. Don't forget that, especially when it's your turn to be in charge." "I won't be in charge," she said. He almost smiled. "Then you'll do fine." He walked out into the rain. Celine stood in the doorway for a long time after he had gone. Then she went back to her steel table, and she sat down, and she began the slow, patient work of building something that did not need lords to hold it together. It would take her decades. She had decades. For the first time in 600 years, that thought did not feel like a sentence. It felt almost like a beginning. The city he walked through that night was not the city he had stumbled into all those weeks before. The streetlights still hummed. The glass towers still rose. But the air had a different weight to it, the way a room feels different after a long argument has finally ended, even when none of the furniture is moved. Trevor pulled his coat tighter at the collar and walked east, toward nothing in particular. Because east was where his feet had pointed when he stepped out of Celine's doorway, and east, in his experience, was as good a direction as any to begin again. He did not know how to get home. The medallion had not given him a return path, and he had stopped expecting one. A Belmont went where the work was. The work, it seemed, had decided he was needed in this strange, bright country of glass and rain, and he had long ago made his peace with the fact that the work was rarely polite about its choices. Behind him, in covens and in tunnels, in barracks and in safe houses, his name had begun to travel. Not his real name. They did not know his real name. They had given him others. The whip in the dark. The old hunter. The man who walked out of the wall. The vampires whispered about him with a wariness they had not used for any enemy in 1,000 years. The Lycans spoke of him with something closer to respect, the way a wolf speaks of a winter that taught it something. Mothers in both species would, in the years to come, use his shape to quiet restless children, and the children would grow up half believing he was a story, and half hoping he was not. Trevor knew none of this, and would not have wanted it. Legends were a kind of debt, and he had spent his whole life trying to settle debts, not collect them. He simply walked, and as he walked he listened, the way he had always listened. Somewhere a few streets over a woman screamed once and fell silent in a way that did not sound natural. Somewhere above him a shape moved across a rooftop too quickly for human shoulders. Somewhere ahead a long black car slowed at a curb and a man stepped out who did not blink in the rain. Trevor's hand drifted, almost without his asking it to the worn leather grip of the whip at his hip. He smiled, just a little, just at the corner of his mouth. The work, it seemed, was not done. The work, in his experience, was never done. He turned the corner into the dark, and the city closed quietly behind him, and somewhere in the long unwritten night of a world that was not his own, the last of the Belmonts went on doing the only thing his blood had ever taught him how to do. As long as monsters walked, so would he.